The revolving glass doors whispered open, spilling Isabella Hart into a world that felt designed to make her small. The lobby of Cross Enterprises gleamed with an intimidating perfection, marble floors polished until they reflected her scuffed shoes, golden accents glinting beneath a skylight that stretched high enough to scrape the clouds. Men and women in tailored suits moved briskly around her, their expensive watches catching the morning light, their voices a symphony of self-importance. Isabella tugged her thrift shop blazer tighter across her chest, the fabric thin from years of second-hand wear. Her resume, folded carefully in her trembling hands, was her only shield. She paused at the reception desk, where a woman with flawless hair and sharper eyes looked her over in the way Manhattan professionals often do when they suspect someone doesn't belong. "Name?" the receptionist asked, voice clipped, polite enough to conceal the judgment simmering beneath. "Isabella Hart. I'm here for the assistant position," she stammered, forcing her voice into something resembling confidence. The receptionist gave a thin smile, tapping keys with nails that gleamed like lacquered steel. "Mr. Cross will see you shortly. Take a seat." Isabella obeyed, lowering herself into a leather chair that probably cost more than her entire month's rent. She smoothed the creases of her skirt and stared at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson, where the river shimmered like scattered diamonds. For a heartbeat, her mother's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her to never bow to men who thought money made them gods. Isabella's fingers tightened around the resume until the paper bent. She couldn't afford to let her past bleed through her composure. Not yet. 47 minutes later, deliberate, a power move she'd expected, the receptionist called her name. Her legs carried her across the cavernous lobby, through corridors lined with abstract art that screamed wealth without warmth until she stood before a set of double glass doors. Inside, Alexander Cross's office was less an office and more a kingdom. The space spread across an entire corner of the tower, with mahogany shelves lined with awards and financial journals, a massive desk of dark oak, and windows that offered Manhattan sprawled beneath him like his personal empire. He didn't rise when she entered. Alexander sat with the relaxed arrogance of a man who had never been told no and expected he never would be. His suit was tailored so precisely it seemed sewn into his skin, and his gaze, piercing, blue, unreadable, assessed her like she was another acquisition on the table. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth, commanding without effort. "Please, sit." The chair across from him was deliberately lower, an old trick of dominance. Isabella lowered herself carefully, allowing her hands to fidget with her resume as if nervous. In truth, she had rehearsed every gesture. She knew Alexander Cross's reputation, brilliant, ruthless, impossible to please, but she also knew men like him thrived on feeling in control, on rescuing the supposedly fragile. If she wanted this job, if she wanted access, she had to play the part. "So," Alexander began, leaning back with fingers steepled, "tell me about yourself." Her throat tightened as if she were unprepared, though the words she spoke had been crafted with surgical precision. "I graduated from community college with a business degree. I've worked in a few small firms, nothing big, but I've always dreamed of working somewhere important, somewhere that matters." She let her eyes widen, just slightly, when they swept across his office. She breathed the last sentence like a confession. Something in Alexander's lips curled, not quite a smile, but a signet, full of satisfaction. He believed her. Of course he did. Men like Alexander always wanted to believe they were someone else's dream. He flipped her resume open with a casual glance, though his eyes lingered more on her than the page. "Community college," he said. "Interesting. Sometimes ambition means more than pedigree." She nodded eagerly, letting her voice falter as she added, "I know I don't look like much, but I work hard. I can learn fast. I just need a chance." Suspense swelled in the silence that followed. Alexander's eyes searched her face, reading weakness, vulnerability, a project he could mold into something valuable. He mistook her carefully crafted hesitation for innocence. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned forward. "You're hired," he said simply. The words should have made Isabella smile. Instead, she dipped her head, letting gratitude soften her features while her pulse pounded with something far darker than relief. He had no idea that the timid girl sitting across from him wasn't there just for a paycheck. She was there for answers, for justice, for a truth buried deep in the foundations of his empire. And Alexander Cross had just opened the door to let her in. The elevator hummed softly as it carried Isabella to the 32nd floor, the beating heart of Cross Enterprises, where ambition smelled like fresh ink and desperation. The doors opened to reveal a world buzzing with polished shoes and whispered rivalries. Assistants darted between glass offices with trays of coffee, their eyes sharp with the kind of hunger that came from knowing one mistake could end their careers. Every wall gleamed, every desk was perfectly aligned, and every glance lingered on Isabella just a little too long. She felt it immediately. She was an outsider in her thrift shop blazer and second-hand heels, an intruder in a place that measured value by designer labels and last names whispered like passwords. The other assistants exchanged looks as she passed, the kind of glances that sliced D's, than words. She kept her head down, clutching her notepad like armor, reminding herself she was not here to win their approval. She was here for something far more dangerous. Her desk was positioned outside Alexander's office, a space designed to remind her every second of who held the power. The glass walls gave her a perfect view of him as he moved with the ease of a man accustomed to obedience. He spoke into his phone with clipped precision, his gestures sharp, his presence filling the office even in silence. He was younger than most of the executives, but carried himself like someone who had already outplayed them all. By midday, Isabella had already made her first mistake. The coffee order, a ritual of survival in this office, had been whispered to her in rapid fire: triple espresso, soy latte, almond cappuccino, oat flat white. Her hands shook as she balanced the tray, and when one cup tipped, spilling a stream of brown liquid across the marble floor, the nearest assistant smirked. "Welcome to Cross Enterprises," she murmured, her voice honeyed with poison. Before Isabella could clean the mess, the glass doors swung open. Alexander stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene with the kind of gaze that could strip a person bare. For a heartbeat, she thought he would fire her on the spot. Instead, his lips curved into something unexpected: amusement. "Relax," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command softened by surprising warmth. "It's coffee, not blood. Just don't make a habit of it." The assistants around them stiffened. He never defended anyone. He never excused mistakes. Yet here he was, giving Isabella what felt like protection. She lowered her eyes, whispering gratitude, though inside her chest a storm gathered. This man had no idea who she really was, or why her presence at his desk was the most dangerous thing he had allowed in years. That evening, when the office lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, Isabella stayed behind. Papers scattered across her desk, notes she had pretended to copy from his instructions. But her real attention was elsewhere. She glanced at the door to his office, slightly ajar, his computer still glowing with numbers and graphs. Her hand itched to push the door wider, to step inside, to search for the secrets she knew were buried in his empire. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A single text glowed on the screen. "Don't forget why you're there." The words chilled her more than the air-conditioned silence. Someone was watching, someone who expected results, someone who reminded her that falling for Alexander Cross's rare kindness could be the most dangerous mistake of all. She tucked the phone away, squared her shoulders, and forced herself back into the role of the shy assistant. But as she passed the glass office one last time, she caught Alexander's reflection in the window. He was watching her too, with eyes that seemed to weigh her carefully, as if sensing that the girl he had hired on instinct carried shadows he could not yet name. The game had begun, and neither of them understood just how high the stakes would climb. The office was supposed to be quiet after dark, but silence inside Cross Enterprises always carried tension, as if the building itself never slept. The cleaning crews moved like shadows, their carts rolling softly across the marble floors. Isabella remained at her desk, pretending to organize files, though her mind was fixed on the man inside the glass office behind her. Alexander Cross had stayed late too. His jacket hung on the back of his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the sharp lines of a man who thrived under pressure. His phone buzzed every few minutes, but it was the faint crease on his brow that caught Isabella's attention. He was not a man who liked to lose, yet the frustration in his movements suggested a problem even he couldn't control. Around midnight, a call came that shattered the illusion of calm. One of the company's biggest clients had threatened to pull out of a deal worth hundreds of millions. The carefully built presentation that was supposed to secure the contract had been sabotaged, files corrupted, slides wiped clean, backups mysteriously missing. The assistants panicked, shuffling papers and whispering excuses. Alexander's temper, usually controlled, sharpened into a razor edge. His voice cut through the air as he demanded answers, his eyes narrowing on each terrified employee. Isabella stood at the edge of the chaos, her notepad clutched to her chest. She could have stayed silent, could have blended into the panic, but the truth burned on her tongue. She had studied the presentation earlier that day while organizing the folders, her photographic memory capturing every detail without effort. Her hand trembled slightly as she stepped forward. "I think I can help," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The room stilled. Dozens of eyes turned on her, some filled with scorn, others with disbelief. She was the new girl, the one who spilled coffee and wore second-hand clothes. What could she possibly know? Alexander's gaze locked onto her, sharp and assessing. "You?" His tone carried disbelief, but there was something else beneath it too. Curiosity. "Yes," Isabella replied, lifting her chin. "I remember the slides, all of them. If you give me a computer, I can rebuild the entire presentation." A ripple of laughter escaped one of the senior staff, quickly silenced by the weight of Alexander's glare. He gestured to the nearest laptop. "Do it," he ordered. Isabella sat down, her fingers flying across the keys. Numbers, graphs, and words spilled back onto the screen as though she were pulling them from the air. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate, her mind moving with a clarity she rarely allowed herself to reveal. The room fell silent as executives leaned closer, watching her reconstruct in an hour what a team had spent weeks perfecting. When she finished, she spun the laptop toward Alexander. Every detail was there, from the financial forecasts to the color-coded charts, exactly as it had been before. A slow murmur of astonishment spread across the office. Alexander studied the screen, then studied her. His expression shifted, the arrogance fading for a moment into something unreadable. "How did you do that?" he asked. "I pay attention," Isabella replied softly, her voice carrying no pride, only truth. The silence stretched, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Alexander saw more than a nervous assistant. He saw fire hidden beneath ash, a mind sharper than most in the room, a potential that unsettled him. Later, as the others filed out, relieved the crisis had been averted, Alexander remained in the doorway of his office, watching Isabella gather her things. His voice carried across the room, low and deliberate. "You're not who you pretend to be, are you?" Isabella froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She forced a smile, casual, dismissive. "I don't know what you mean." But when she left the building and stepped into the cool night air, her phone buzzed with another message, this one colder than the last. "You're getting too close. Don't forget the plan." She stared at the words, the city lights blurring in her vision. Inside the tower, Alexander Cross still watched from the window, suspicion in his eyes, unaware that the girl who had just saved his empire carried secrets powerful enough to destroy it. The invitation came in the most unexpected way. Isabella had just returned from lunch with the other assistants, enduring their snide remarks about her clothes and her clumsy grace, when Alexander's door opened and his voice carried across the floor. "Miss Hart, dinner, tonight." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even framed as an order. It was something more dangerous, a command disguised as generosity. The room went still. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Every assistant turned their head toward Isabella, their eyes wide with envy and suspicion. Alexander Cross didn't take assistants to dinner. He dismissed them, replaced them, ignored them. Yet here he was, inviting the girl who had spilled coffee in her first week. Isabella forced a polite smile, pretending to be caught off guard. Dinner, sir? She asked softly, as if she hadn't already guessed that this moment would come. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You saved my company last night. I don't let loyalty go unrewarded. 7 o'clock, the Luminare. Dress appropriately. Then he disappeared back into his office, leaving a trail of whispers in his wake. The Luminare was one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place where meals cost more than most people's rent, and where every table came with an unspoken guarantee of privacy. Isabella had been there once before, though Alexander didn't know that. Not as a guest, but as an observer, when she was gathering intel for her mission. Tonight, she would step into it as his companion, and she could already feel the weight of unseen eyes that would follow her. When she arrived, the maitre d' led her to a table near the back, lit by golden candlelight and surrounded by velvet curtains that muted the buzz of the other elite patrons. Alexander was already there, waiting, a glass of wine untouched in front of him. His suit was darker than the shadows, his tie precise, his gaze sharp. When he saw her, something flickered in his expression, approval, perhaps even surprise. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from a thrift store, but the way she carried herself made it look like couture. You clean up well, he said, his voice carrying a trace of something that almost sounded like admiration. And you look exactly as expected, she replied, before she could stop herself. A spark of amusement lit his eyes, as though he wasn't used to people daring to tease him. Dinner unfolded like a game of chess. He asked questions about her childhood, her ambitions, her family. She gave half-truths, wrapped in careful vulnerability, letting just enough tremor slip into her voice to feed his curiosity. He spoke of his empire, of the ruthlessness required to build it, of the nights spent fighting off competitors who would see him destroyed. But in between the boasts, Isabella saw cracks. A fleeting sadness when he spoke of growing up without warmth, a hesitation when he mentioned betrayal. For a moment, the world outside their velvet curtain faded, and it was only the two of them. A man who had everything but trust, a woman who had nothing but secrets. Then she noticed it, the faint glint of a camera lens across the room, half hidden behind a vase of orchids. Someone was watching them. Her pulse quickened, though she forced her expression to remain calm. She sipped her wine, her mind racing. Was it one of Alexander's enemies? Or was it her own shadow, the one who kept reminding her why she was here? Alexander leaned closer, lowering his voice. You're different, Isabella. Most people who sit at this table try to impress me. You don't. Why is that? She met his gaze, steady despite the storm inside her. Maybe I don't need to, she said softly. The words hung between them, electric and dang. Heiress. Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression darkening with intrigue. He had no idea how true her words really were. She didn't need to impress him because she already had the power to ruin him. As they left the restaurant, Alexander placed a hand lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that seemed protective but felt possessive. Outside, the city hummed with neon light and restless energy. Isabella glanced behind them, and for the briefest second, she caught sight of a figure slipping into the shadows, phone in hand. Someone was recording every step she took with Alexander Cross. Her phone buzzed with a new message just as the car pulled up. This time, the words were sharper, colder, impossible to ignore. You're losing focus. Remember why you're there. Isabella slid into the car beside Alexander, her heart thundering against her ribs. She had stepped into his world tonight not as an employee, but as something more, and that made her mission infinitely more dangerous. The city had gone quiet by the time Alexander's car slid to a stop outside his penthouse. From the street, the building rose like a shard of glass against the midnight sky, each floor glowing with power and wealth. He motioned for Isabella to follow, his expression unreadable, his movements carrying the ease of a man who expected the world to bend. She hesitated at the doors for only a second before stepping inside. The elevator ride to the top floor was suffocating in its silence. Alexander stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the numbers ticking upward. Isabella felt the weight of his presence pressing against her carefully crafted composure. She could still feel the echo of the text message burning in her pocket. You're losing focus. Remember why you're there. When the doors opened, she was met with a view that almost stole her breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the whole of Manhattan glittering like a field of stars, the city's heartbeat visible in the rivers of headlights streaming below. The penthouse was designed to impress: steel, marble, rare art pieces chosen to announce wealth rather than taste. Yet something in the space felt empty, as though it was all surface, no warmth. "Drink?" Alexander asked, moving to the bar. His voice was smoother than the whiskey he poured, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "Water's fine," Isabella replied, slipping into one of the leather chairs. Her fingers brushed against the stitching. It was flawless, like everything else in his world. He brought her a glass, then lowered himself into the chair across from her. For the first time, his posture wasn't rigid with control. He leaned back, exhaling as if letting go of a burden no one else could see. "Do you know what it's like," he began slowly, "to have a room full of people who smile at you but secretly pray for your failure? To build something with your bare hands only to feel like the ground beneath you could be taken at any moment?" Isabella's pulse quickened. She had studied his life, memorized his victories and scandals, but nothing in the reports captured the exhaustion in his eyes now. She wanted to say yes. She knew exactly what it felt like. She wanted to tell him about nights she had fallen asleep to the sound of debt collectors pounding on her family's door, about the empire her father had lost when companies like his had crushed him. But she couldn't. Not yet. "You're strong," she said instead, her voice careful, laced with just enough vulnerability to draw him closer. "People only want to see you fall because they know you're standing higher than they'll ever reach." He studied her, his gaze piercing. You talk like you've lived it." Her heart skipped. For a second she thought he could see through the careful mask she wore. She forced a small laugh. "Maybe I've seen enough to understand." He leaned forward, resting his glass on the table. The city lights carved sharp lines across his face, softening the arrogance that usually defined him. "You're not like the others, Isabella. They come to me for money, for power, for status. You make me feel like I don't have to pretend." The words sank into her like a weight. For the briefest moment, she wanted to believe them. She wanted to believe that behind his ruthless exterior was a man capable of love, capable of being more than the empire he ruled. But then the vibration of her phone pulled her back. Another message glowed on the screen when she stole a glance. "The clock is ticking. Find what we need." Her chest tightened. She looked back at Alexander, who was watching her with an intensity that made her wonder if he sensed the war raging inside her. She smiled faintly, but her mind was already spinning. Somewhere in this penthouse, somewhere behind locked drawers or encrypted files, lay the proof she had come for. Alexander reached across the table, his hand brushing hers in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Whatever world you came from, you're part of mine now," he said, his voice low, certain. Isabella forced herself not to flinch. He thought he was drawing her in, binding her closer. He had no idea that she was already inside, and that every moment he led her closer to his heart brought her one step nearer to the truth that could shatter him. Rain streaked across the glass walls of the Cross Enterprises tower, turning the skyline into blurred lines of silver and shadow. Isabella sat at her desk outside Alexander's office, pretending to type, while her heart beat like a drum against her ribs. The messages had been coming faster now, sharper than ever. "No more delays. Tonight you get access. If you don't, everything we've built will fall apart." Her fingers tightened around the phone until her knuckles whitened. She had always known this mission would demand betrayal, but she hadn't expected how much harder it would become with every passing day. Alexander had begun to lower his walls. She had seen him smile without calculation, heard his voice soften in moments when no one else was watching. Those glimpses of the man behind the armor unsettled her more than the ruthless millionaire everyone else feared. The glass door to his office swung open. Alexander stepped out, his tie loosened, his expression weary but softened when his eyes landed on her. "Come with me," he said simply. No explanation, just certainty. He led her into the elevator and pressed the button for the underground garage. The silence between them pulsed with unspoken tension. Isabella could feel the weight of her handler's demands pressing against her chest, but Alexander's presence, solid and steady, drew her deeper into a dangerous conflict she hadn't prepared for. They drove through the rain-slick streets until the city lights gave way to the quiet edges of Manhattan. He parked in front of a building that looked ordinary on the outside, but once inside, Isabella realized it was anything but. The place was a sanctuary, a hidden world Alexander had never shown anyone else. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, old leather spines and rare editions arranged with reverence. Paintings leaned against the walls, unfinished, as though someone had abandoned them mid-stroke. In the corner sat a piano, its keys worn from use. "This is where I come when I need to remember who I was before all of this," Alexander said, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "Before Cross Enterprises, before the headlines, before people looked at me and saw only dollar signs." Isabella moved slowly through the room, her hand brushing over the piano keys. "You play?" "Used to," he said, watching her. "My mother taught me. She believed music made us human. My father believed money made us untouchable. Guess which one won?" The rawness in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. This was the moment her handlers would have wanted her to strike, to slip away and search for files, to find the safe or the computer that might hold the evidence she needed. But instead, she turned back to him, caught in the storm of his confession. "You don't have to be what they made you," she whispered. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and searching, as if he could see the truth she fought to hide. "And you, Isabella? Who made you? Because I can't shake the feeling you're not who you pretend to be." The words sliced through her, closer to the truth than he realized. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, her phone vibrated again. She glanced at it quickly, and her blood ran cold. A picture filled the screen, her younger brother tied to a chair, a bruise on his cheek, his terrified eyes staring at the camera. The message below was simple and brutal: "Deliver the files by tomorrow night, or he disappears." Her hand trembled as she locked the screen. Alexander was still watching her, his gaze heavy with suspicion and something else. Something dangerously close to tenderness. She forced a smile, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Maybe one day I'll tell you," she said softly. But inside, Isabella knew the walls were closing in. She was no longer just playing a role in Alexander Cross's world. She was standing at the edge of a war between her heart and her mission. And by tomorrow night, she would have to choose which side she belonged to. The next morning, the tower pulsed with an electricity Isabella had never felt before. Reporters clustered outside the glass doors, cameras flashing as security forced them back. Inside, executives moved with frantic urgency, whispers breaking like waves across the marble floors. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Alexander emerged from the elevator, his jaw tight, his expression carved from stone. His eyes swept the floor and landed on Isabella, lingering just long enough to make her chest tighten. "My office. Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. She followed him into the glass fortress, her palms damp. On his desk lay a thin envelope, its seal broken, its contents spilling across polished mahogany. Newspaper clippings, photos, financial records. But what made Isabella's blood run cold was the image on top. A blurred photo of her taken years ago, long before she ever set foot in Cross Enterprises. She was younger then, desperate, standing beside her brother outside a courthouse after their father's trial had destroyed everything they owned. Alexander held the photo between two fingers. His eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. "Care to explain this?" Her throat tightened. She forced herself to breathe evenly, but her mind screamed with panic. Who had sent him this? Was it her handlers tightening the noose, or one of his many enemies hoping to turn him against her? "I don't know where you got that," she whispered. He leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Don't lie to me. You walk in here with a thrift store blazer and trembling hands, And yet last night, you rebuilt a multi-million-dollar presentation from memory, and now this shows up on my desk. Who are you really, Isabella? The air between them crackled with tension. She wanted to tell him everything, that she was here under orders, that her brother's life hung in the balance, that she had never meant to fall into this dangerous closeness with him. But before she could form the words, his phone rang. He snatched it up, listening, his face hardening with every second. When he hung up, his voice was steel. The deal in Singapore collapsed overnight. Our files were hacked. Every investor brief synced. Olen, someone on the inside is feeding information out of this building, and if you think I haven't noticed how you appeared just before all this started, you're a fool. Isabella's chest constricted. This was exactly the trap her handlers had set. Frame her before she could deliver the files. Force Alexander to turn on her. She lowered her gaze, struggling to keep her composure. You think it's me? She said quietly. I think, Alexander replied, his voice dangerous and steady, that I made the mistake of trusting someone who has been playing a part since the moment she walked through my doors. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again. She didn't dare check it, but she knew what it would say. A reminder, a threat. Her brother's life hanging from a thread. For a long moment, Alexander just studied her, his hand clenched around the photo, his eyes searching her face as if he wanted to believe in her but couldn't. Finally, he turned away, his voice cutting the air like a blade. You're not leaving this building until I know exactly who you are. One of us is lying, Isabella, and if it's you, I swear you'll regret ever setting foot in my world. Her heart pounded as the door shut behind him. The walls of Cross Enterprises, once a cage she thought she could navigate, were closing in fast. Every secret she carried threatened to spill into the open, and now the man whose heart she had begun to steal was standing on the edge of turning into her greatest enemy. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside Isabella's chest. Lightning cracked over the skyline as she sat trapped in Alexander's office, every second dragging like chains. Security had been told not to let her leave. She was a prisoner in the empire she had infiltrated, and the man she had begun to care for more than she dared admit was the one tightening the bars. Alexander returned just past midnight, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the sharp lines of his face harder than steel. He tossed a folder onto the desk in front of her. Pages spilled out, documents she had never meant him to see, financial traces, fragments of her past, surveillance stills of her brother. Do you want to tell me why half of your life doesn't exist on record? He asked, his voice low and lethal. Because I had my best team dig into you. They found nothing. People don't just appear out of thin air, Isabella, unless they have something to hide. She forced herself to meet his gaze. You don't understand. Then make me, he snapped. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then slid it across the desk. He caught it before it fell, his eyes narrowing as he read the new message aloud. Deliver the files by sunrise or your brother dies. His voice cracked on the last word, though not with weakness, with rage. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable, his anger not fully directed at her anymore. So that's it, he said, almost to himself. This isn't about me. You've been blackmailed. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, not from fear, but from the relief of truth clawing its way into the open. She swallowed hard. They took him months ago. They said if I got close to you, if I found what they wanted, they'd let him go. I didn't have a choice. Alexander's fists tightened, veins rising along his forearms. Who? I don't know their names, she whispered. Only that they're powerful, rivals of yours, men who want to see you destroyed. He began pacing the room, every step radiating fury. For the first time, she saw him not as the cold millionaire who could command the world with a phone call, but as a man who had been hunted for years, surrounded by enemies, eager to strike. You should have told me, he said finally, his voice breaking through the silence. You would have thrown me out, she replied, her voice trembling, and then they would have killed him. The room vibrated with silence. the distance between them charged with betrayal and something far more dangerous, unspoken trust. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then he strode toward her, his hand gripping the back of her chair as he bent close. "You've been playing me from the start," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "But so help me, Isabella, if they think they can use you to break me, they don't know who they're dealing with." Her heart skipped as she realized what he was saying. He wasn't pushing her away. He was pulling her into his world. "We'll find your brother," Alexander said, his voice steadier now, a vow forged in fire. "But from this moment on, you tell me everything. No more lies. If you lie again, Isabella, I won't forgive you. Not as a man, not as an enemy." Her tears finally fell. She had come here to deceive him, to dismantle his empire piece by piece. Yet here he was, offering not condemnation, but alliance. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the faint spark of hope. But hope was fragile, and as Alexander pulled her close, vowing to protect her brother, neither of them noticed the red light blinking faintly on the corner of his desk. A hidden camera had captured every word, every revelation. Somewhere in the shadows of Manhattan, their enemies were watching, and the trap was already closing. The city never truly slept, but that night Manhattan felt haunted. Alexander stood at the wide glass window of his penthouse, the skyline burning like a field of fire, his reflection sharp and restless. Behind him, Isabella sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her phone clutched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. Neither spoke for a long time, the silence thick with questions, neither dared voice. "See." Finally Alexander turned, his eyes burning with the steel of a man who had made an impossible decision. "We're going after your brother. Tonight." Her breath caught. "What do you mean? You don't even know where they're keeping him?" He held up a tablet, swiping across encrypted files his team had pulled within hours. "I have contacts who owe me favors. These men who took him, they're not ghosts. They're parasites. One of my rivals, Bennett Hale, has been moving in the shadows for months, leaking poison into my deals. My people tracked unusual shipments to a warehouse in Red Hook. That's where he'll be." Isabella's pulse pounded so hard she could barely hear. "If you're wrong..." "I'm not wrong," Alexander cut in, his voice sharp. Then softer, more dangerous. "They thought they could use your pain to destroy me. They thought they could bend you into a weapon. But they underestimated one thing." Her lips parted. "What?" "They underestimated what I'll do when someone I care about is threatened." The word care lingered in the air, trembling with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Isabella looked away, afraid of what it was doing to her. She had spent months lying to him, weaving her mask, but in this moment, her heart betrayed her. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe there was more to him than ruthless ambition. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Alexander would bring only a handful of men he trusted completely. Isabella would come, not because he wanted her there, but because she refused to stay behind. She had already lost too much. The warehouse crouched against the East River, rain falling in heavy sheets that blurred the glow of dockside lights. The air smelled of salt and rust and danger. Alexander's convoy stopped a block away. His men armed themselves in silence, their movements efficient, professional. Isabella's breath fogged in, the night as she followed him through the shadows, every step dragging her closer to the moment she had dreaded since the first threat. Inside, the warehouse pulsed with dim light. The hum of generators echoed off steel beams. Alexander moved like a predator, every stride controlled, every glance precise. Isabella stayed close, her eyes scanning every shadow. Then she heard it, a muffled cry. Her heart lurched. They found her brother in a back room, tied to a chair, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. "Isabella," he rasped when he saw her, his voice cracking with relief. She rushed forward, tears burning her eyes, her hands shaking as she tried to untie the ropes. But Alexander froze, his instincts screaming. It was too easy, too staged. And then he saw it, the faint red dot of a laser sliding across the floor toward Isabella. "Get down!" he roared. grabbing her and pulling her to the ground just as the first gunshot exploded. The warehouse erupted with chaos. Shadows moved in the rafters, gunmen emerging from hidden platforms, the ambush closing in from all sides. Alexander's men fired back, the air splitting with the thunder of bullets. Isabella shielded her brother with her body, trembling as shards of glass rained around them. Alexander stood in front of them, fearless, a wall of fire and fury. Through the smoke, a figure emerged, clapping slowly, mockingly. Bennett Hale, tall and cold, his smile cutting like a blade. "Cross," he called, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "I always knew your weakness wouldn't be money or power. It would be a woman." Alexander's jaw tightened. Isabella's heart nearly stopped. The trap had been more than blackmail, more than leverage. It had been designed to break Alexander's empire at its core. And now, with guns aimed at all of them, the truth was undeniable. She wasn't just the bait, she had been the fuse. The warehouse smelled of smoke and gunpowder, a storm of violence raging within its steel walls. Bullets sparked against metal beams, shouts echoed through the rafters, and yet, in the middle of the chaos, time seemed to slow. Isabella crouched beside her brother, her hands still clutching the ropes that bound him, her heart split between terror and a truth she could no longer hide. Alexander stood in front of them like a shield, every muscle taut, his eyes locked on Bennett Hale. The rival's smirk glowed in the flicker of gunfire, his words cutting through the din. "Do you know who she really is, Cross? Or did you let her pretty eyes blind you like the fool you swore you'd never become?" Alexander didn't flinch, his voice like iron. "She's mine. That's all I need to know." But Isabella's chest constricted with a pain sharper than fear. His faith was misplaced, and Bennett knew it. That was the knife he had been sharpening all along. Bennett laughed, cold and merciless. "You think she stumbled into your office by chance? She was sent. She's been feeding me information since the day you hired her. Every deal you lost, every leak in your empire, her hands carried it." The words cracked through Alexander like a whip. He turned his head just enough to look at her, his eyes searching, demanding truth. She wanted to lie, to tell him Bennett was spinning poison, but her silence was already confession enough. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling yet resolute. "I was sent. They took my brother. They forced me. If I didn't give them something, they would have killed him." For a moment, Alexander's face hardened into stone, betrayal etched across every line. But then his eyes flicked to her brother, still bound and bloodied, and something shifted. He understood. Betrayal had not been her choice. It had been her cage. Bennett's voice rose, gloating. "You see, Cross, even the woman you thought you saved is just another weapon aimed at your heart. You built an empire of steel, but you forgot the oldest rule of war. Empires don't fall from the outside. They crumble from within." Alexander lifted his gun, his voice calm but deadly. "Then watch what happens when you underestimate me." The firefight ignited in full fury. Alexander's men pushed forward, bullets tearing through the shadows. Bennett's gunmen fell, one after another, but not before fire lit up the air around them. Isabella dragged her brother to cover, her body shielding him as the storm raged. Then the moment came. Bennett raised his pistol, aimed directly at Alexander's heart. Isabella saw it before anyone else, a split second of clarity cutting through the chaos. Without thinking, she moved. "No!" she screamed, throwing herself in front of Alexander just as the shot rang out. The bullet grazed her side, fire searing through flesh, but her body held. She collapsed against him, pain stealing her breath, but her eyes locked on his. "I couldn't betray you, not in the end." Alexander caught her, his arms fierce around her trembling frame. Fury roared in his chest as he leveled his weapon and fired. Bennett Hale's body dropped, his smirk erased forever. The warehouse fell into silence, broken only by the groans of the dying and the ragged breaths of the living. Alexander lowered her gently to the ground, his hands pressing against the wound, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, Isabella. Don't you dare leave me now." She smiled faintly through the pain, her eyes heavy but filled with something fierce. "I came here to steal from you, but somewhere along the way you stole me instead." Sirens wailed in the distance. Alexander's men rushed to secure the scene, but he stayed bent over her, his forehead pressed to hers, his world narrowing to the woman who had walked into his office as a stranger and turned into the only thing he could not lose. And as the blue and red lights washed over the warehouse walls, Isabella realized her secret past had finally collided with her future. The mission was over, but her heart's war had only just begun.